What is up, Watch Fam? I am Christian from Theo and Harris, and today I'm back at London Jeweler's wonderful Manhasset watch boutique. And a couple of weeks ago, we did our first video of this sort, where I pick one of their brands, whether it's Grand Seiko, Rolex, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Panthere, IWC, so many, and I say, instead of reviewing one watch, let's jump into the entire brand's catalog, pick out a couple of highlights, and kind of do an analysis of maybe the health of the offering. So a couple of weeks ago, we did do Grand Seiko. Wonderful experience. I learned a lot about the brand, and I was so impressed. But now I'm going to go back and do one of my personal favorite brands, probably my favorite brand of all time, Cartier. So let's get into it. I picked out the pieces that I feel best represent Cartier's current collection. We have the Panthere, the Santos, the Tank Louis, and the Drive. So let's go one by one. Let's start off with the Tank Louis. This is Cartier's most classic watch. While not their first watch, the Louis was introduced in 1917, whereas the Santos Dumont was introduced informally in 1904 and then formally in 1911. So this watch is a couple of years later, but it has undoubtedly become the king of Cartier. Its design is classic, no frills. It's what Cartier is best known for today. Now, there have been many iterations of the Tank Louis since its inception, ups and downs, and I think that right now, Cartier is in a pretty good place with this model, and let's take a look at why. We picked out two models. This is the larger of the two, and I think it's lovely. Let's go through some of the details that I think Cartier executed particularly well. First off, the dial. Traditionally, Cartier has chosen a white dial for their Tank Louis models. This dial is close to white, but has a silverish shimmer. It's richer, it's a little less harsh. I think the contrast is a little bit muted, which I think is great. The extra long crown here is a tremendous win for Cartier. They did this at its inception, but many times, in many different iterations of the Tank Louis, they opted for a more compact and conservative, a less dramatic crown. But this is what the Cartier cabochons should look like. It just points out so aggressively. Again, for a conservative watch, that is a bold design choice that I think is necessary. The smaller model is definitely closer to vintage proportions. Looks great on my wrist, but I can completely understand how this is a woman's watch today, how most men wouldn't touch it. That being said, I do think it is worth looking at if you do appreciate vintage watches. The only space in which I think that this smaller example kicks the butt of today's larger example is in the omission of the date window. I'm a Cartier purist in many ways. I don't think that the date belongs in a Tank Louis. Now, that being said, this is a well-executed date, so good job there, but still, it's an interruption of the dial. It's not as smooth as if it's just omitted. So in that area, I got to give it to the smaller example. Having mentioned the Santos already, let's move on to their new Santos. This is a watch that was released, I want to say 2 years ago, could be 3 at this point, time flies. But this is, in the, grand understanding of Cartier history, a new reference. Today we have one in large size and one in the mid-size. The large is in steel, the mid-size is in pink. In order to understand this watch and why it's important, and really evaluate whether or not it's properly executed, it is important to look back into the history of the Santos itself. First, the Santos was made by Cartier for Albert Santos Dumont, who was a Brazilian pilot. And now this watch, like I said, which was just released a couple of years ago, is more of an evolution of the Santos Galbi than it is of the Santos Dumont. So again, in the Santos line, but the Santos line has quite a few offshoots. So how do they do? Frankly, mid-size is a wonderful size for me. The bracelet does taper a little bit thin, so I could see certain modern wrists having a problem with that, but I think it's wonderful. It's conservative, but still chunky, so there's a bit of compromise there. It's a sporty watch. If you've ever tried on an original Santos Galbi, you can definitely see how this watch is a more approachable evolution of it. That watch, which I think is absolutely phenomenal, is inherently more, it's vintage, old manish, it's thinner, its bevels on its case and its bracelet are far sharper. It is a more polarizing watch. This Santos is a compromise. It takes all of that design DNA from the original Santos Galbi and brings it into not just modernity, but into a more palatable context. I know Cartier has worked very hard to develop a sports watch. Sports watch and Cartier don't jive perfectly. The idea of a sports watch and a Cartier is a bit of an oxymoron, but they have done it well here. And the biggest notable change or development here, while not genius, is very useful. It's their quick release spring bars. Watch, I'm gonna do it right now. That's it, no tools needed. Sometimes development doesn't need to be genius, right? Sometimes it could just be useful, which I think a lot of watch brands have lost sight of. Anyway, this is a tremendously useful complication already back in, and good for you, Cartier. Speaking of the relationship between Cartier and sports watches, this is, I think, their newest model. It is the Drive de Cartier, and this is the ultra-thin example in stainless steel. This watch measures 38 millimeters, an impressive 6.6 millimeters thick, or should I say thin. Perfect watch, super big dial. I definitely think it wears much larger than 38. So let's talk about the Drive for a second. Like I said, Cartier has tried to develop an appropriate sports watch for a while. What does appropriate mean? I think appropriate means a sports watch that, while sporty, does respect the lineage of Cartier. It does make sense within the context of its design language. That's imperative. Cartier can just go make a sports watch. Anyone can do whatever they want. But if a brand wants to claim that they have some sort of history, that they have design language, that they have nuances that are their own, that are present through the collection, they can't do that, right? They need to stay within certain parameters. The development of the Santos Galbi and then eventually this Santos makes sense. But it's, again, about as far to the borderline as Cartier could have gone without being disingenuous. But I think that this Drive is perhaps a better example of a sports watch Cartier that's true to the original Cartier mission. You have the thinness, you have a manually wound caliber, you have no date, you have no second hand. Traditional Roman dial, as the Santos does as well, but its size and its metal, being steel, make it sportier. Now, you certainly couldn't compare this to a Patek Nautilus or Rolex Submariner, but you can't compare Cartier to those brands. It's a different brand, it's a different identity. If Rolex tried to make a tank, it would look weird, right? Let's try this. Another recent release from Cartier, I believe the Panthere was reintroduced in 2017 in a couple of metals. It was in steel, two-tone, pink, and this is yellow. This is a watch that I have been historically unsure about. The Panthere is basically a softer Santos Galbi. The Panthere, if you remove the bracelet, looks more like the original Santos Dumont. And because of its softer lines, it has been more adopted by women than men, barring Keith Richards, who actually wears one quite famously. But I finally got it on my wrist, and I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the comfort level of the bracelet. I'm impressed with the case proportions. This is definitely a women's watch, but a vintage Cartier lover, I think, would find it very hard to not at least consider the Panthere. Okay, so in summary, I think Cartier is doing a wonderful job, and it makes me happy to say that. Cartier is a brand that's been confused many times. Don't forget, Cartier is a designer of watches and jewelry, and not a watch manufacturer. Cartier has a history of outsourcing their movements, just like so many other brands do. This is something that they should be proud of. Cartier traditionally owned the supremacy of their designs, their dedication to their formal design language, and to see the reintroduction of the Panthere, to see the introduction of the drive, especially in the ultra slim variation, to see Tank Louis with a bit of a more vintage vibe. Even in a model we don't have here is the Cintre. Again, a terrific addition to the collection. Overall, Cartier is doing a great job. I hear they're lowering their prices on precious metals. I hope that that is in fact true. Their precious metal watches tend to be too expensive, but I see a very strong future for this company. I hope they continue to design lovely things, and if they do, I will continue admiring them. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you again to the folks over at London Jewelers. Sorry, Anthony, I did not need your help with this selection. Again, geeks, if you are looking for a watch boutique in Manhattan or on Long Island, their customer service and incredible access to inventory is second to none. We're so proud to be working with them, and we hope you guys are enjoying the content. That's it, rant over. This is a manually wound watch with a sub-second and a power reserve. The case is extremely impressive. Not only is its shape unique, but it's so detailed. Even if you look super closely at the lugs, they're actually faceted from the inside. We're used to seeing Rolex, for instance, with large external facets, but here it's the opposite.